Let's implement the most popular payment processor named Stripe. I'm using Stripe's SDK to enable website visitors to buy my products by going through Stripe's checkout flow. I'll start with a demo and follow up by going through the code that was needed to realize this. At the end, I'll share my experience, the pros and cons, in my opinion, with the Stripe platform, its API and SDK. Pay close attention because I'll throw in a few tips along the way. I'm running the kisscode.com website locally. I went to the blog detail page. I added this support section with a coffee button. Once you click that, you can select the amount of coffees you want to support me with. I made an assumption about the price of one coffee. Submit. We get a payment link. And that's where tip number 1 comes in. I always do this in 2 steps. First, a submit, going to my backend to do whatever is necessary, then respond with the actual checkout URL, which is the payment link. And once I click that, I go to the Stripe hosted form, which opens another tab. If I were to do that in one go, so I click submit, I do everything in the backend that's needed, store something to the database and so on, and only then return that checkout URL, and then automatically redirect, so whenever that's done, redirect to that new page, then the browser is going to see that as a pop-up, and it's going to potentially block that pop-up because it took too long between the user interaction, between my submit click and the new window to open. So the browser is going to see that as some unwanted pop-up that came up. So the Stripe hosted checkout form, where I see the total amount and all of the products for the checkout. So 2 coffees that we selected are now listed as 2 separate product items. On this form you see the payment methods, so card or PayPal. I will show you in the code how to expand that list. Let's submit the form with some testing data, so we're in test mode with some dummy data that Stripe provides. And then it redirected me back to my website. Let's take a look at the code. I created a payments module. Let's start with API extensions where the endpoints are defined. And then we have the extension method at payments API as usual to register all the services we need. So the Stripe client, we'll dive in a bit. Stripe configuration, which is going to get the API key from the app settings. So let's take a look at that first. On the brand implementation project API, let's take a look at development settings. And there I see the Stripe config with an API key. And this is the testing key. In the app settings.json, you should put the live key. So that's all this config contains, is just that API key. The Stripe client we'll talk about later. Let's first look at the endpoints. And there I have the post endpoint, where we're going to start with the checkout flow. Let's take a look at the payment request. That can hold a few products. A product has a price, name and description. A quantity, that's actually just the total amount of products. The metadata is useful if you want to pass down custom key value pairs like internal IDs or just a custom message. You could pass that all in there. Success redirect URL and cancel, that's when it's the checkout was successful. We're going to redirect back to the website and maybe to a specific landing page saying thank you for your purchase. And then the cancel, that's going to do something similar. We're going to pass that request data down to the Stripe client. the checkout method. And there we use the actual Stripe SDK coming from the NuGet package. So stripe.net. The first thing we're doing in the Stripe client is setting the global configuration for Stripe, just passing down the API key from the app settings to configure Stripe with. We're creating a checkout session. So that's the session create options. Mode payment can be either payment or subscription for recurring payment. So this is a one-time payment actually. Currency, USD or Euro or whatever you like. Then the payment method types, that's where you can expand. So for me, these are relevant. Bank contact, ideal, SEPA, and so on. These are more European ones. If I want to use these, I have to set the currency to Euro, so Euro. We'll take a look at that in a bit. Then the metadata, that's the custom data you want to pass down. Then the success URL and the cancel URL coming from the request that are going to be used, of course, after the checkout was successful or not successful or just cancelled. Then the line items we're going to fill with the products. So for each product, creating a new line items option. The quantity, so you could say 5 pencils, or in this case, it's just 1 coffee per line. Could have put all of the coffees in one line as well. 1 line per unique product probably makes sense. So 5 coffees and then underneath 10 pencils or something. But I wanted to illustrate the lines, so I just made 1 line for each coffee. Price data. That's where you'll define so then I have to set this one to Euro as well. To define the price of the product and the unit amount. This is in the lowest unit value. So for US dollars and euros, that will be cents. So that's actually times 100. So 1 euro is 100 cents. Product data is just gonna have the name and description of the product. More info about the product. What you could do in here as well is, instead of defining a custom price and a custom product, is you can reference prices and products that are specified in the Stripe dashboard. You can basically hold a catalog of products, a whole database of products hosted on the Stripe platform, and then just reference that by using something like that, and then the actual price ID or the product ID and so on. I'll show you more about that in the documentation later. For the product, you could do a similar thing. Instead of the product data, just have the product, and then that would be the product ID. Like that, and that's then gonna look for the matching product in the Stripe, on the Stripe platform. Let's undo those. And then finally, we're going to have a new session service. So the checkout session, create a checkout session and get a URL, so a checkout URL. And that's what we're going to return to the front end in a simple payment response. And that's then that payment link that you saw. Tip number 2 would be to store a summary of the payment details, so like the metadata or the IDs, the reference IDs, in your database alongside with the status of pending. So then you have that record, then you know, oh, this user initiated a payment, but then maybe later on didn't complete it, or or did complete it, so you can kind of have a list of successful and aborted initiated payments. It's always nice to have. Let's take a look at the demo again before we dive into this webhook, because now we have the checkout URL. Let's say 5 coffees. The checkout URL, which is this payment link, which is just an HTML8 tag that's gonna open a new tab. Now I have it in euros, which is good. All the coffees are there. And now I also have multiple card methods. So I could choose Bankcontact, which is more Belgian. I'm going to press pay again. And now I set a breakpoint in the code. And it hit that webhook method with a request object, having the type checkout session completed, and then it should have some more data, object, ID of the payment, and so on. So what happened here is the checkout got completed, but that was on an entirely different page, one from Stripe itself. So that had nothing to do with my application, so I wouldn't be able to know whether that was successful or not, or processed. So Stripe gets that information, and once they know whether it was successful or cancelled, or even when the payment got processed, then they're actually going to notify us, so my application, telling us what the status of that payment is. So we need to expose an endpoint for them to call whenever that they have more information about the payment. And then we get the type of the webhook, so of the notification, and that can be checkout session completed or expired, or payment succeeded, async, because a payment can take a while. And then this session complete and session expired is basically just going to say whether that checkout, so the page you just saw where we filled in the credit card details, whether that session was successful or not, that checkout session. Based on these statuses, you can act. So what I said before, like to store a summary of a payment, you could then update that database record if you have the correct ID. So find that record by ID or reference or whatever, and update the status to either completed or even paid. Expired, that means the user didn't really complete the flow, but maybe send them an email to remind them, or offer a discount. That seems to be a common trick. And that's also where you can say, okay, they ordered 10 pencils, let's decrease my stock with 10 pencils, and let's put everything in motion to fulfill that order. That's all for the checkout flow in the backend. Let's take a look at the front end. We'll first take a look at we saw the payment request, payment response we saw as well. And the shared SPA just has a HTTP client to do that HTTP call to the backend, and we're going to read that payment response, so the checkout URL, to form the link. The state has nothing for now, just registering these services. Create payment form is a simple Blazor form with all of those coffees that you saw. And handle payment form, so submitting it for each coffee selected. So we're adding a new line item with the coffee with the price of 5 USD or euro. One coffee gifted, so the name and the product name and description. Then those success and cancel URLs, you can kind of specify them yourselves, and then create a landing page to handle these. And then we do the HTTP call with all of that information, show the payment link, and so on. So the database is empty for now. I didn't create one, But let me show you what a payment summary could look like. I have one example. I called it transaction, but yeah, you can call it whatever you like. Payment might be a better name. So a description, the amount is going to be the price. Metadata, we saw that. So the custom metadata we want to pass through. And then some data coming from the payment processor, so Stripe. Let's take a look at the transaction metadata. So that's all some custom metadata that can tell you more about what product did the page visitor buy. You can actually use the Stripe SDK, the event object, actually event utility dot construct event. You can find it in the docs. You'll have to do something like that for E, let's just call it E. And then you should be able to access all of these things. You also have the event that's also coming from Stripe. I wanted to bind it like that, but that's not working because of JSON serialization stuff, types not matching. So that wasn't really useful. I made my own DTOs for that, but those, yeah, it's a pretty large complex object, so I stopped at the ID, but it could have had the metadata as well. You can either use the SDK stuff, I'll show you the documentation after this, and the same for this one, events.checkout async payment succeeded, so you can use that from Stripe. I also typed them out in string, but that's gonna be events just for the demo dot checkout session completed and then session expired and so on. So let's now take a look at the docs and then afterwards at the platform. Okay, so the Stripe hosted page could also have other ways to put it on your website, but this checkout flow. So that's basically the steps we went through. The customer clicks on something to purchase, to check out, so the shopping cart or a donation button, whatever, resulting in a checkout URL that leads us to the Stripe hosted payment page, that leads the customer there, I mean. Then the customer can enter the payment details and submit, so pay. And then sometime later, we don't know how long later, Stripe will notify us with session completed or session cancelled, and then maybe after that another time with payment successful or payment failed. And then a bit lower you can find some more code. You see an example of the session create options that I just showed you with the line items as each product. And then in the bottom you see price, that's what I explained as well, with the price ID, so that you could basically, that's a reference to a product or a price specified on the Stripe platform in your account. And then you also have the Stripe API, where you can find some more info about the data the API is expecting and so on. So this is for the SDK, and then this is for the API if you just want to find more details and maybe see how what the responses look like. And for the payment details, you might also want to check the API reference. Then you see there's like 30 payment methods according to your region. And then let's take a look at the actual platform where we're getting that test key. At the top here we have test mode. I'm gonna toggle that, and then going to the developers page where we can find the API key. The second tab. Then there's a public key and the secret key. We need that secret key and add that to our development app settings. Then the webhook tab is where you can specify your HTTP endpoint that Stripe needs to call whenever that notification is ready. But you can also set up Stripe with the Stripe CLI, command line interface, to listen to your local host. And then you can even, so you would have to log in and then listen to wherever your local host is running, on what port, and then what URI. You can do all that in the terminal whenever you have that Stripe CLI installed. And then you can even trigger a specified event, so payment succeeded, and so on, to mimic the behavior, and then have that post endpoint and act accordingly on the payment succeeded, and so on. Whenever such payment succeeded or failed, you can see that in the events or in the logs of Stripe. So here it's saying $5 US succeeded, and then you can see the details. But let's take a look at the logs. So here you can kind of debug what happened, what the statuses are for each attempted checkout. So it's all pretty well documented for the SDK. I went a bit overboard with my demo because I wanted to show you the most common flow, I would say, the checkout flow, where a page visitor wants to buy multiple products from your website. Then you can use that checkout flow. But for simply accepting some donations or support, you could maybe consider creating a payment link that's going to then lead them to some payment form. You could create a button using the JavaScript from Stripe. You could even make QR codes to scan and much more. So that brings me to the pros and the cons of Stripe, in my opinion at least. Starting with that broad range of useful features like the payment links, checkout flows, all of the support for the front end and the back end, so the SDK API, all the front end forms, embedded forms, QR codes, you name it. Even features that I couldn't find in other payment processors to work with partners and so on. I would say they have splendid documentation for the SDK, for the API, all of the flows are well explained. And they have an awesome platform where you can manage everything. And makes it very easy to get started thanks to the SDK and this nice platform. Test modus, grab a key and you can start. And I think it's the most well-known one, the most popular one, thanks to its broad range of supported countries and payment methods, which makes it a great choice. So in my opinion, the arguments against using Stripe, I found the developer experience a bit clunky. That forced me to use the SDK while I actually wanted to use the API straight away, just doing HTTP calls. And I soon noticed that it does not support sending JSON data to the API. So it expects form data, URL encoded form data, which is a bit annoying to work with. Then you have to serialize arrays, lists, or nested objects and make sure that everything is stringified. So you can't have numerics, you can't have other types. So that was kind of annoying to serialize that. So I was forced to use that SDK, which probably also just does some HTTP calls under the hood. And if you look at this event object, then the response data is also a bit clunky with the data and then an object and then all the rest. So to map that to response models, response DTOs, that wasn't too much fun either. And if we look at the examples, so serializing or deserializing data, and we're getting conversion errors in here as well. So that makes me wonder about the compatibility or how old this code is. Yeah, these are some MVC, Model View Controller examples. So after some time of trying to serialize and deserialize stuff, I gave up and I just used the SDK. And then I trial and errored my way through, because it wasn't always clear which were the required fields, properties for the requests. But Stripe gave us really good error responses, telling me, oh, you forgot the price ID, or the price ID is not in the correct format, or and so on, or you're using USD instead of Euro, but you're trying to get the European payment methods. All in all, I think Stripe is awesome with all of its features, all of its support for use cases, developer support, documentation. But I would have preferred to just use the API sending over some JSON data. The payments module was the last building block of this brand website. Now that all of these are built, all of the rest should be no problem. I'll make sure to publish the entire project with all of these modules included and styling to Patreon, so you can grab yourself a copy. If you like this video, don't forget to let me know by hitting that like button and subscribe for upcoming videos. And you can even let me know what your experience is with my content on my gisco.com website. I hope I see you in the next one.